Getting rid of some of my terms.
So how's everything going at the World Service at the moment?
So I'm at World TV now, and I do bits and pieces sort of on my own stories for World Service. But World TV is good. I mean, it's pandemic is it's a global story. It's, do you know what I mean? It's kind of not our bread and butter, because something doesn't happen all the time, but yeah, it's what we're used to doing. You know what I mean? Covering a story from like many different angles around the world. So I've been in the newsroom throughout, and that was at times quite stressful, in the early days, and we didn't really know what was going on. And I think it wasn't even something, I was very rational. My parents were both doctors. They'd sent me, masks and gloves very early on. The BBC was great in that it put on our sort of taxi service so that we didn't have to get on public transport. That's ended now that obviously more places on public transport are open, and they have some rules in place. But I think even just psychologically and subconsciously, your whole body's kind of knows it's under threat, and it doesn't know where the threat's coming from, but you're just a bit on edge. And we had to adapt a lot with the protocols. So broadcasts can be very process driven, and that's great when, everything is working. But then when you have to sort of throw that up in the air and redesign it in terms of how many people are allowed in galleries, how many studios you've got going, all of the rotas, merging teams, merging broadcast hours. It even just kind of who you report to in which hours, and just kind of like swabbing down like your desk or any headphones you touch, or, you're used to kind of running into an edit suite to get something ready. And you have to run extra fast because, you have to wipe everything down with an alcohol wipe before you can log on and all of that stuff. So that's like took some while to get used to, but now it just feels totally normal.
Yeah, I think it gets a while to get used to the logistics of how to keep live 24-hour news going during, a new way of production, a new way of sourcing content.
Yeah, and I think in the way though, it's I can't speak to other news outlets, and I know obviously the pandemic has affected different kind of mediums and different media in different way, because you've got, for example, the papers, people tend to go out and buy a paper, whereas people at home are kind of, slightly captive audience syndrome, so a lot of our figures at the BBC, just in the team I work with, have skyrocketed. We've got huge increases, and to be honest, those were happening before the pandemic anyway. So I think that speaks to some of the other trends, and also what's going on in other parts of the world to do with trust in the media declining elsewhere, and it being seen really as comparatively, a very trusted brand globally for us at World News. So yeah, we've had bigger audiences than ever, which is weird when you're kind of operating with a real sort of skeleton team, but you're covering like the biggest story that you could possibly ever cover in some ways, and it's just so much of it. But again, pros and cons. It used to be really difficult to get people, set up for interviews. Now, especially in the early days, no one was going anywhere, so it was like, you're going to be available. Well, what else are you doing? Get on the Zoom, get on the Skype. So that, things like that were quite nice. So, when one thing became more difficult, something else, became easier, and swings and roundabouts,
Yeah, no, I can kind of notice it from another angle of pitching stories to media, working for an NG at the moment, and trying to work out how we get content across.
Just going to share the Facebook link on Twitter quickly.
Cheers. Yeah, shall we get started? Yeah, so thank you for everyone who has joined us for tonight's discussion on how we can practically support young people during the COVID pandemic. If this is your first Young Fabian event, we at the Comms Network, we're a hub for young people interested in journalism, PR, and other related media or comms professions. We sit within the wider Labour Party, so we're very much about influencing policy within the media sector, within wider comms. We've run some great events, including tonight, as well as last month on tackling a lack of diversity in the media industry. So we're really interested about practical ways in which we overcome those challenges, those barriers facing young people and accessing the media. If you're interested in hearing about our further events, about any interesting news that we're retweeting, that we're engaging with, you can follow us at YF Comms. We can give us an email at commsnetwork@youngfabians.org.uk. So the media industry has been one of the most affected industries. It's hard to have a kind of monopoly on that, but one that's obviously and ironically been reporting on the coronavirus crisis and the human impact and the economic impact that's been having on people. But its ability to report on not just the impact, but on wider news is being affected by real uncertainties with regards to funding, to the way the media industry is structured. Back in April, Oliver Dowden, the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, said that the pandemic had caused the biggest existential crisis in the history of the press, as local and national newspapers experienced circulation decline. The ongoing lockdown continues to threaten the ability for young, diverse voices to start a career in journalism. So local and national media outlets are starting to feel the pinch of the pandemic, with UK news desks at Buzzfeed being cut in the political news desk, and over 180 jobs lost at The Guardian recently. Further job losses at Reach PLC, which manages the Daily Express and Mirror, have seen 550 jobs lost, and similarly with the BBC, with their regional broadcast programmes, which are really a great place for young journalists to cut their teeth, have been cut. So we'll be looking in this session about how the sector is continuing to affect the prospects for young people entering the sector, but also look at practical solutions that might help and support young people into the sector despite the pandemic. These problems are, of course, more intractable than the pandemic itself. Class, race and disability and gender have traditionally been barriers for young people in accessing largely London-centric internships and entry-level jobs. So all too often, talented young journalists are being held back in their ambitions, not as a result of ability, but as a lack of financial means and contacts. This evening, we'll be speaking to Olivia Crellin, the co-founder of the social enterprise Presspad, which was founded over 2 years ago, about how we can support young journalists under lockdown. Olivia herself is a freelance producer, on-air reporter and documentary filmmaker working primarily for BBC World Service in their London office. She covers stories about human rights, women's rights, immigration, world politics, the environment and social movements. Since the start of the pandemic, Presspad has been providing remote mentorship and pitch clinics and networking sessions. I think they're running one now, actually.
Yeah, we are.
I think it's like a speed networking thing, which sounds a bit daunting.
It's intense, but you know, that's the training you need for this profession. Yeah,
it's a bit of a elevator pitch for a lot of people, I guess. So since the start of the pandemic, it's been linking people to these kind of opportunities, whereby you're seeing kind of cuts to the sector. People can't obviously travel and lockdown to take on internships and access the kind of in-person mentorship that they need to remotely fine-tune their skills under lockdown. With internships and entry-level positions on hold at offices and newsrooms downsize, and in some cases shut their doors, we'll look at how young people can move ahead in their careers. So Olivia, the situation seems pretty grim for the media industry. It's obviously nothing new. Why do you believe it's worse as a result of the pandemic?
So I think obviously in comparison with other crises and global recessions that we've seen, this is pretty huge. It affects everybody, and it's also something that we haven't really experienced before in this global connected world that we live in now. So I think a lot of it is very novel. We don't know, we have that added dimension of not knowing how long the situation is going to go on for, whether there will be second waves or not. So it makes planning really, really difficult. So I think, as you say, the media has been confronted with all sorts of different crises. And a lot of the time, it continues to develop and morph and, has responded, throughout to technological innovation. And I think this is no different. There are actually lots of positives to be seen, whether that's, the use of technology to, I mean, in the early days of the pandemic, it sounds like, I'm talking about in ye old early days, only a couple of months ago, I think it really kind of it knocked everyone for six, especially the broadcast industry, just trying to work out, how do you, with something which is, quite a physical sort of job, getting out there and talking to people, how do you do it? But I think, Amal Rajan did a fantastic piece, I remember really vividly, of, all the different ways that production teams, were getting around things, were even editing remotely, in different rooms through different countries. So technology is fantastic. So I do think that there are positives, but right now, the lack of uncertainty, with a cure or with a vaccine means that it's just so difficult to plan, budgets and impact, and nobody truly knows when things will go back to normal. Although I do think, week by week, there are plans being made, and whether those, remain in place, whether we get another spike, I think, with time, there's more information, and as long as I think you're armed with information, you can make more informed decisions. The other thing I would say, though, is that with the pandemic, we had this kind of almost bizarre kind of real world lab experiment in sort of, a chance to zero a lot of, situations, put everything literally on pause. And, some of those were incredibly positive, like looking at the impact on climate change. Suddenly there were no cars anywhere, everyone stayed at home, a lot of sort of, I guess, industry pollution was put on pause. And that was not something that you could ever have, achieved otherwise. Same perhaps with homelessness. There's this feeling, I think, with the pandemic and this phrase, the new normal, the idea that we can kind of, almost wipe the slate clean and start again. With newsrooms and with other, I think, organizations, this is a double-edged sword, because I think managers have been looking at the situation and saying, okay, so we actually can produce this program with half the people or with half the studios. Interesting. We have to make cuts. Maybe we had to make cuts even before all this started.
Mm-hmm.
Here's our solution. So I think that's something that previously perhaps there may have been reluctance or reticence, to go ahead with those cuts, not knowing what the impact might have been. And I think also in turn, everybody individually, people are more isolated. It's harder for people to, I think, collectively sort of form together in groups and, and stand up for their rights sometimes. So I think, there was a big movement online when it came to freelancers and what kind of rights they had and falling through the gaps. And I think, like with any dispersed or isolated group of people, everyone in their own homes, it is much harder sometimes to stand up and say, okay, well, actually, the way you've gone about this is wrong. Plus, with the severity of the emergency, I think some people may have even felt, in the grand scheme of things, what chance do I have putting my case forward when, we're responding to this unprecedented crisis? So those are some of the things that might have made it worse.
Mm-hmm. And you sound kind of a note of optimism there, that you feel that perhaps there's an entry point for newsrooms to change not only what they report on, but what their newsrooms look like, quite critically, in terms of diversity. Is there kind of any hope about, this shaking up the media industry and giving perhaps younger people a chance? I know job cuts are obviously horrendous and millions of people in the country are unemployed at the moment, but is there kind of, I know from my sister, she works for the Telegraph, and it's such an old boys club, as with a lot of newspapers. Is there kind of a point at which young people can kind of take advantage of this and hone their skills?
Yeah, I think there are, again, pros and cons. So, with technology, not always the case, but, traditionally younger people are a bit savvier at that. We've got great examples of journalists, for example, Sophia Smith-Gaylor, who's at the BBC, who, one of the few, I think, young journalists who has really kind of embraced TikTok. So definitely there are new platforms always that, if you want to make a mark, and it's something that, you really kind of chimes with your way of communicating or doing journalism, then definitely those are open. And I think, social media continues to kind of thrive, and during this kind of lockdown and, sort of social distancing world that we're in. And it's always been blurring the lines, within journalism and kind of pulling down gatekeepers. So I think for young journalists, my concern is that while I see a very entrepreneurial spirit with a lot of, recent graduates and younger journalists who are really, I think, being captivated, in particular the more socially aware kind of generation, Gen Z types, in wanting to do things differently, there has to, I think, be an awareness in order to maintain, diversity at the forefront of that, which is just so crucial, to make sure that we don't fall into the same, problems and, kind of elite patterns of the past. There has to be a way of monetizing people's efforts. So, I think I've seen a lot of people saying, oh, I set up this new project. It's really exciting. We're writing about this and this. We'd love to get your pitches. Oh, brackets, by the way, we can't pay anyone at the moment, but don't worry, we're not getting paid either. And it's like, that's not sustainable, guys, and it's great to see people with the initiative. And that's great, if it's kind of a lockdown project and we've got some plans in place, to go after some big funds, and grants to make sure that there is a place where young people can get paid for their work. Because what you'll see is the more people that get made redundant, the more experienced journalists you then have moving into the freelance space, the more then they're probably winning and impressing, the commissioners and taking up the budget, which are already being squeezed anyway. So there is a kind of knock-on domino effect. And I think definitely there is a chance to create new spaces, but how sustainable is that? Especially when, we're thinking about how we can fund it. And there definitely are answers to that. And I think you're going to ask me a little bit on what young journalists can do to kind of build their skills during lockdown. Some of those, which I can mention, when we come to it later, are to do with thinking about how to monetize your own platforms. Because nowadays, we have Medium, which you can monetize. We've got Substack. Newsletters are so popular. It feels like everyone's starting a newsletter or podcasts, and there are definitely ways to monetize those things. So, while in the beginning it may seem like you really don't have that much traction, that can change really, really quickly. And consistency is always, the key with a lot of these projects. So if it's something that you feel passionate about and you're going to be in it for the long run, then definitely get into a platform that allows you to make some money out of that. Because otherwise, you're just looking into a very bleak future. And what have you got to lose, really? But
it kind of goes hand in hand, because you have, the rise of social movements, Black Lives Matter, protests. Last month, one of my panelists, Patrice Peck, who is a freelance journalist in LA, she started a newsletter for coronavirus for Black folk. It's with white newsrooms, you're not really reporting on the issues that affect the Black community. It's, some of that is creating, with advertising revenues going down at the moment, it can have a chance to really shape the media towards perhaps where young people are, which is, social action, towards solutions journalism, to reporting on some of the issues which older editors turn their noses up.
Yeah, and I think more and more, I'm always encouraged by, the efforts sort of within, the newsroom that I work in at the BBC, because, there is, while it takes a long time to turn around, cultures and big organizations, there is such a thirst for and an awareness that young audiences are important and that diversity is important. And I think, there's definitely a hunger from commissioners and from managers and from editors for this kind of content. And, as part of the Presspad Remote, I've been doing pitch clinics and CV clinics, and part of, my message always to young people who maybe, are a bit insecure about their background, maybe they've got an accent, maybe they're, wear a headscarf, whatever it may be, some element, maybe they never got a degree. And, for them, sometimes that makes them feel like the absolute kind of outsider, that they're failed, that they're never going to get a way in. And I say, guys, genuinely, you're the voices and the people that we're looking for, because the media is full of people like me. Genuinely, no one should be interested in what I've got to say. I mean, that's not strictly true, but, I'm saying use that as your strength. Don't see that as a weakness anymore, because really that's your strength. The things that, the people that are not as represented or as present in our newsrooms are the ones that we need. And those are the areas where, we're not going to be inundated with, sources, because, those sources are people within perhaps your community that are harder to reach, for the pre-existing press corps perhaps, but for you, those are people you went to school with, those are people that live around you. So, those are things that are really worth highlighting, I think, now. And I think we've reached that tipping point where I could confidently say that to somebody without kind of, feeling like I was maybe throwing them under the bus if they got the wrong person. I think now even editors who, perhaps are not as aware, or perhaps are not as instinctively understanding of the power and actually the benefits of diversity. Because really, diversity isn't this kind of, and this is what Presspad is all built on, it's not this kind of nice add-on. It is like the foundations. It explains why, we're not doing journalism well. It explains why there's a lack of trust in the media. It explains a lot of the failings editorially of the British press right now can be traced back to diversity, I believe. So, you can see that actually, if you address that, a lot of the other problems, oh God, how do we find us, someone to talk about this? How do we access that? Those problems go away because you have the answer right there and there in your diverse staff.
And we've just touched on Presspad. I was wondering if you could talk through how you set it up, and kind of going on chronologically to where we are at the start of the pandemic and with the start of Press Remote. Yeah.
So Presspad was something, I guess it came out of my own experience, and I never sort of hide the fact that I consider myself incredibly privileged. Both my parents are doctors, they're both psychiatrists, make of that what you will, slightly scary. But, I went to private school, I went to Cambridge for undergrad. I then flew to the other side of the world to start journalism in South America. And that was because even with all that privilege, I had grown up in the Midlands. So I was born in Brixton, but my parents moved out because I couldn't afford the cost of living in London with 2 young kids and both working in childcare, etc. So I grew up in the Midlands, and I didn't know how you got work experience to start with. Like, I'd done a bit of student journalism, but I just didn't even understand, like, nothing was advertised anywhere. Like, how do you get, how do you get these opportunities? I didn't realize that, a lot of it was sometimes nepotism, networking, reaching out, that there was this informal kind of way of doing it. There was no real structure. And then on top of that, the cost of, I calculated the cost for me to go to London and do, a set of, and because it's never just one that's enough, right? A set of these kind of 2-week worth of work experience, not being paid in different places, then having to foot the bill for my whole existence, find somewhere to stay, which literally there was, like, I think 2 options. And, I wasn't sure that I could ask that of those people. They were sort of, old kind of family friends, sort of people that my parents went to uni with. So I just took a decision, slightly radical, to go to the other side of the world. And that really paid off for me because I learned Spanish, I worked for Reuters, I was, ended up reporting on really big kind of national stories that I never would have had the chance to do, I didn't believe, in a newsroom kind of starting out at that stage that quickly. So anyway, so I had this experience myself, and I thought, God, if I've got this really privileged educational background and I'm really, pretty well off, but just because I grew up in the Midlands, I've got all these barriers, geographically, and then the cost of living in London. Now there's a housing crisis. All the internships are still not paid. It's even more competitive. You have to pay. There's a sort of notion that now everybody needs a master's to get in. Just more and more things stacked against people. So how the hell did 95% of the rest of society that we should have in our newsrooms, how are they managing it? So that's where it came about. And then once I got actually got a staff job at the BBC, so I'm a staff journalist there now. But once I got that, and I was working in different departments, I noticed that actually my colleagues were fairly affluent and were doing rather well. And if they'd married, often they had 2 properties, now within a family, and that there was just a lot of goodwill, curiosity, but also privilege, and kind of a lot of ways that this was going kind of untapped. And so I thought, what if I connect the people that have the space, have the experience, have that stability, and those who are looking for it, and there's this exchange. So that's how PressPad came about. I put something out on Facebook, and I said to just my friends, would anyone be up for doing this? I got, I think, about it was between 12 people, I think, at first, and that soon rose to 20. And then that's it. I started the pilot, and it's just kind of grown a little bit like crazy from there. And PressPad Remote really is our response to COVID. And we were able to pivot quite quickly because we had got funding from something called the Future of News Pilot Fund, which was being run by Nesta and Bethnal Green Ventures with money from DCMS. And they basically, because, how do you put on a hosting service, essentially when people are having to be in lockdown and socially distanced? So we were like, oh, geez, we want to do something for people. And so we came up with PressPad Remote, and it launched at the end of April. And since then, so just in the last 3 months, we've reached over 7,000 people, wow. Put on 29 events, and we have a kind of weekly calendar of, and that's not including our clinics. So on Mondays and Fridays, we have our CV clinics, which were crazy popular. And I think that's partly down to some of the advice I'll give, young people on what they can do if they've got a lull in work. Go back to TV and take a look at that. And then on Fridays, pitch clinics. And then we do a monthly remote speed networking, which is going on right now. We have weekly Instagram Q&As with kind of aspirational and inspirational sort of role models, so slightly younger journalists. And then we have a weekly webinar, which is on a variety of different things, how to network, all sorts of things like that. So that's what we've been doing, and it's been a lot to kind of keep that going. And luckily, we had the funding from Future News Fund to make that change. But we hope to be bringing back with our new kind of marketplace website, which will digitize and kind of increase the numbers of people that we can match and host. We hope to be bringing that back live in January, if there's no second spike, sure. Which is the problem with all of this, right? Yeah. And that's kind of slightly what we've seen as the timeline for other newsrooms in terms of this return to normal, because of course a lot of, well, we didn't feel too bad about obviously not suspending that kind of hosting service, because we didn't have anyone to host, because all of the newspapers, and broadcasters had stopped their work experience and their trainee schemes. And those are slowly coming back. But it's a real mixed bag in terms of who's deciding to bring, what back when. And of course, there's now these remote internships thrown into the mix, which, are kind of a mixed blessing, I think.
Do you think remote internships level the playing field at all in terms of being able to advertise, not having as many overheads for young people to have to, if it's a national, to come down to London? Do you think it's given a bit more scope for people who otherwise wouldn't take on an internship or wouldn't even have those contacts to get their feet stuck in?
Yeah, so I think I feel like I'm such a politician. I'm giving on the one hand, on the other hand. What we've seen is, I think, a lot of the big media organizations, kind of, the nationals, sort of slam the brakes on, I think, quite strongly in terms of, putting anything on. There are a lot of schemes that are continuing to go ahead. So I made a bit of a list if that's of interest to anyone, but there was a great article done by, I'll go through them if you want, by Freddie Mayhew for the Press Gazette just at the beginning of this month. But, the BBC has stopped its journalism trainee scheme until January and paused its work experience. The Telegraph's editorial graduate program is kind of in mid-flow and is continuing. Sky News is continuing its apprenticeship scheme without any changes. Guardian is trying to make adjustments for its Scots Trust bursary scheme, but then at the same time has stopped work experience and its positive action scheme, and that's a scheme which targets journalists from Black, Asian and ethnic minority ethnic backgrounds and those with disabilities. The Sun and the Times publisher News UK is having some things put on pause. So they have like a week of kind of work experience for 16 to 21-year-olds. That's not happening, but their trainee scheme is. So it's a real mixed bag. But I think when it comes to remote internships, our blog editor, Amber Sumner, did 2 really excellent pieces that you can find on our website, and I can post the links if you want, but I could do that right now. Looking and talking to people who had actually, gone ahead with remote work experience, and some of them said, I got to do things that otherwise I wouldn't have, because especially I think in local and smaller organizations where they wouldn't have felt that there was enough space or scope. Whereas others said, I went ahead with something that I already had planned, but it's just really awkward. Like, I don't know how, do you know what I mean? When you haven't met anyone, how do you read those social cues? There's all the kind of awkwardness of it. There's none of that, sort of obvious water fountain, I'll make you a cup of tea kind of moments. And I think journalism in particular sort of thrives off that. I think, but at the same time, as you say, there's none of those costs, and it's showing actually that so many things that we thought we couldn't do remotely, we can. And so that, I think, really, and I've been saying to a lot of young people, right now it is harder to travel. So if you're somewhere, that has a story, do you know what I mean? You can kind of own that story and say, I'm here, I'm embedded in a community, because other journalists, especially at the beginning, they weren't being sent all over the place because that just, that just wasn't the environment. So definitely, I think good things can come of it. But I think perhaps maybe with the more structured internship schemes, unless, they really have been thoughtfully adapted. And I think it's just so difficult to do that in the early stages because we just, it's all so new to everyone. I think there will be something that is lost in that kind of pressing of the flesh, getting to know people, because so much of what we do is about relationships. But people have always interviewed people over the phone, in a way Zoom is better because you can see someone's face. So it's, it's a mix. And I think it may also even depend on the intern. So, a very good point that was made when I did a session with some members of the NUJ, made by a woman in a wheelchair user, and she was saying, actually, like remote internships, we've been wanting these for ages because there's so many buildings that are not accessible to us, and we don't have to come in. Like, we can still write and do the same stuff here, and call into conference calls and all sorts of stuff. So I think actually what my hope would be is that internships will come back online, but there will be more of a thought and more of an offering for schemes that enable people to participate from a distance, and that there will be an understanding that there is a way of bringing those people in. And definitely PressPad Remote for us has been excellent because, there's no way we could have got 7,000 people in a room, do you know what I mean, for the even across the number of events that we've been doing, without really limiting the people that we can access to Londoners. So yeah, I think it's got some positives, and it's got some learning curves.
Sure, I guess it depends on what type of journalists you are or what kind of journalism you want to go into as a young person with regards to whether you need that, breaking news reporting from the scene of an incident or a breaking news story, or, sometimes, and it's probably being a bit romantic, but there's no kind of replacement for that in some ways.
Yeah, I think a lot of, there's probably fewer people who are doing that kind of journalism than you think, in comparison with a lot of people,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean, kind of slaving over laptops and whatnot. But sure, I mean, that stuff is still going on, with my role, which is, primarily within a newsroom. I have been going in every single, day as normal, because, we can't put an entire TV, sort of, gallery or output into people's individual homes. That said, we've had presenters who have been presenting from home. So I think it's definitely a mix. And I think, with social distancing and masks, I think reporting in the field can be done safely.
Do you think this may also kind of affect the, media courses, journalism courses? Is there kind of an indication whether those are going online in the autumn, or?
So again, it's a mix. I think that probably the autumn term, will go ahead, but with a lot of trepidation. I think universities are a similar industry perhaps to journalism, in that they've slightly been on rocky ground for a while in terms of, like funding and issues like that. And so all it takes is something like this to, maybe throw a real spanner in the works. And definitely, I think with something that is as practical as journalism, there will be people thinking, oh, well, if I'm not going to be able to make the most of all of these things, then should I just put it off for a year? And I've had conversations with young people about that. Should I just take a year out? But on the other hand, take a year out for what? Going traveling around the world? Probably not the best idea. Getting a summer job? Well, yeah, okay. There are definitely things that are in demand. Lots of jobs that do need people, but also lots of jobs that are being cut. So, on the other hand, I think there's an argument: just push ahead through it, and everyone is learning as you go along. But do you have an alternative? And would you, if you need to take a break, take a break. But equally, I think, you'll make the most of it. And there will be so many exciting stories to cover in this time, that it'll be worth, doing that with the instruction and advice of your lecturers.
Sure. It feels like, everyone's put their kind of lives and their kind of long-term plans for the next year, and hold that it's not as if people are getting ahead of you or kind of getting in there before you. It feels like perhaps there might be a chance just for people to kind of slow down a bit and to, learn the skills, apply their trade a little bit. And I guess perhaps maybe the industry might become a little less snooty about kind of formal kind of academic qualifications.
Yeah, I think that's definitely positive. I mean, I think, there are definitely things where expectations are being rewritten. Before we used to be really, really strict about the kind of, quality of interviews that we would have in packages, and they'd have to be beautifully shot. Now we'll take anybody, do you know what I mean, in their box on Zoom, and, that's fine. And I think that's good, because I think, yes, while obviously there is a real craft to, shooting things beautifully, and I film, and definitely that's a part of it. And, you've got the whole Netflix genre of, beautifully shot documentaries that is constantly, forcing news and current affairs to up its game in terms of like its visuals. On the other hand, you just want to have, great content and great guests. And so, I think lowering expectations on that just shows that actually it's more important what people are saying than, what kind of background or, and again, the access to, previously you may have said, oh, well, we need an expert in London because we need to get our reporter to talk to them face to face. Well, now you don't need that. They could be in Manchester, they could be in Glasgow, they could be anywhere. So yeah, and I think it is for sure there are things that young people can be doing to build their skills. So, we've got our CV clinics and pitch clinics. Taking a look at your CV is really good. I was reading somewhere that a lot of like media exams have been absolutely oversubscribed. because people have time to do those. So shorthand, media law, you can study and do those on your own. That's something that you could kind of hone up on without needing, to be a part of a newsroom or a project. I definitely think that networking online, while it may feel a bit scary doing something like what's going on right now with our PressPad team with remote speed networking, that's also an opportunity. And even just kind of, engaging a bit more on Twitter, or, expanding, particularly right now with a lot of the conversations going on about, different kind of comments and hate speech and racism, challenging yourself to take the time to diversify your news feeds and the people that you follow and you listen to. There are so many different things, redoing your website, starting a side hustle, as I said before, all of those platforms that you can kind of monetize. And I think, the other thing that I've really been doing a lot of is just kind of some contemplation. So, some kind of deep thinking, but also some blue sky thinking, and I think journalism is no different to other industries where, we've been thinking, well, okay, what is this new normal? And I think asking that of yourself perhaps will give you some interesting answers in terms of the journalism that you want to pursue. You may find actually that, without the pressure of constantly feeling like you're having to achieve and add, another work experience, another clip to, your CV, that you have a bit of space to think, actually, what is it that motivates me aside from perhaps all the hustle and bustle and, politics of a newsroom? What do I actually care about, when it's just me and the work? So that's another positive.
And what are some of maybe one or two kind of success stories that you've seen through PressPad Remote? What kind of, don't need to mention any names, just kind of broad kind of brush strokes.
So we've had a couple of people who have got jobs off the back of the CV clinic, which was kind of blew my mind. For me, the reach of the program is just amazing. So, I had one day when I was doing, and I mainly do the pitch clinics and the CV clinics, and Nicola Slawson and Laura Garcia, sort of coordinate the other events. But I had a series of CV clinics rather one day where I was doing a CV clinic for a photojournalist in Nigeria, and then one for a Yemeni journalist, and then one for an Australian journalist in London. And, I was just like, this is amazing, the reach and sort of the community that we're building. So that's been really fantastic. And I think also I'm really proud of the work that our kind of young team has done. So alongside Laura and Nicola, we have Io, who does our social media and is in charge of the Insta Q&As. And he's been getting so much good feedback. People love his very down-to-earth, kind of very relatable, and because he's basically our audience, he's asking people the questions he wants to know the answers to, and they've been fantastic, really stepping up to all the technological challenges, doing what we're doing now here, like streaming something on Facebook and then live tweeting it and all of that. And then Amber, who wrote these pieces I've included here, has been fantastic, and has actually, off the back of doing pieces like this for us, has been commissioned by other kind of more mainstream outlets to publish similar work about the kind of changes in the newsrooms.
Sure. I mean, there's nothing more important than, as a young journalist, knowing how to get through an editor's busy inbox. That's a really vital skill. I mean, when I was starting up, I worked briefly as a journalist for a couple of years. Actually, I was remote learning with a team in Seattle in the States, a publication called Humanisphere. And yeah, I've always been interested in global development. Actually having a team of people who had been in the industry for a while, working for LA Times, having a bit more time to kind of mentor and, working through story structures with me, working how to improve my writing, really did help me. And, this was a few years ago before the kind of pandemic started. And yeah, I didn't feel that any less than kind of going through the more kind of quote unquote traditional ways of getting to journalism. I thought it was actually a really strong way to, besides the kind of time zone differences, which were difficult, get more support, which kind of helped me go forward and hone my skills and really know how to write something that's persuasive, to write.
And I think actually like a lot of newsrooms are quite global. And I remember when I did work experience in Madrid, and I see we've got somebody who's joining us from Madrid, Leah, I think,
Yes.
comments. You know, I did some work experience just after I graduated from my master's for the Wall Street Journal in Madrid. And when I was doing video, I was working to a team who were editing in New York. And so as far as they were concerned, when I was going to sleep, they were, you know, come on, finish those last edits. And it was like 1 a.m. where I was. So I think, you know, some of those, those ways of working existed before, and were kind of, you know, unavoidable when you're coordinating different teams, if it is a big outfit like that. So definitely, I think that there are skills that, you know, I don't think any of the skills that we're developing, while slightly bizarre and not very natural to us, I don't think they'll be wasted, because, you know, if then we can continue and, you know, do many more interviews, or even, you know, between bureaus having calls like this over Zoom rather than flying an executive or an editor out there, then that's definitely better for the climate. And also just, I think, for time and, you know, jet lag and people, you know, flying around the world like crazy. Sure, there are definitely moments where it's important to see somebody, but maybe, you know, the first 2 meetings with a new team, not every single, you know, important meeting. Some of those then can be done online. But yeah, I think maybe as well, you know, because there's an absence of some of the social stuff, which is, you know, is really important, I think, in the long term. It means that maybe people can be more focused on, do you know what I mean, providing you with something more specific and forensic, like that feedback on your writing style.
Sure, and I guess with something like your speed networking that you're going on tonight, it gives more of a, you know, editors, producers are very busy people. It's kind of, you know, it's not just whether a pitch works out for them quickly, it's whether if that person that they want to mentor is a good fit. And it just saves people's time if it doesn't really work out as a scheme, as a kind of mentoring, or it's not a right fit between people. Then you have a bit more speed about that, and you can know that a bit more quicker rather than.
And also, how many of us, like before, like in the first kind of, I guess, weeks of lockdown, I just felt such a relief, because, you know, if you wanted to even just skip and stop listening to me because I'm boring you and go and join, you know, some other event on some other Zoom, you can do it. It's not like you have to, you know, haul yourself into, you know, something appropriate, you know, kind of leave your flat, get on the tube, travel 45 minutes even within London, you know. And then of course there's, you know, people who are in Madrid or you know, in Newcastle or Glasgow or whatever. It just means that there is so much more that's accessible to you. And yes, you know, I think we're social creatures, we're always going to want that. Yes, it's possible to be zoomed out after a long day, but I do think the benefits of having all of that at your fingertips, you know, we now, for example, you know, with the event tonight, we were shy on a few mentors about maybe an hour before it happened, put a few things out on Facebook, and suddenly we'd already, you know, we're oversubscribed with mentors, because there's people that can make that last minute decision. Oh, you know what? Yeah, you know, I'll nothing I like on TV, I'll join that. Why not? Because I don't have to move from my sofa.
Sure, and I guess it kind of tackles that imposter syndrome that, you know, groups, demographics that normally wouldn't get into journalism. They've got a live event they can tune into, maybe just, you know, tune in for a while, see if it's for them, or if it's not. It's not, you know, it can be quite a scary sector for people to go into if it's, you don't know mates who are in it, or you don't know family who are in it. It can be quite imposing, but it's just about taking down those barriers and making it more accessible, which I think flip side of the lockdown has kind of done that, as people can tune in from their living rooms, they can engage at whatever level they can.
We're all on a slight kind of level playing field, because it's like none of us grew up with any tips on how to handle a pandemic, you know, or how to, you know, handle all of this Zoom culture. It's not, whereas I think newsrooms traditionally are actually quite, the way they're designed, are kind of designed to, you know, having that, you know, news kind of hustle, sort of gathering where you pitch all your ideas, that's actually quite intimidating. But, people who have gone to maybe private schools and, have been part of like the debating society, or spoken in assemblies, or, have gone to Oxbridge or, Russell Group universities or Durham or something, and they're used to kind of defending their, 2,000 word weekly, essay in front of their peers and, their incredibly scary professor. That's something that skill that they've been developing for kind of years, and that other people maybe don't have. And so I think there is definitely, something about this new space that we're all kind of a bit rubbish at, and, you can have somebody who otherwise would be really terrifying in a meeting, and, they're just kind of goldfish, because they forgot to unmute their stuff. I mean, come on, what is going to level the playing field and make us all feel. I remember when I was, I had a sports teacher. I did quite a lot of sport quite seriously when I was at school, and I had to go to some quite important trials for a kind of an England position, which I didn't get in the end. But remember, she said, her father always told her, just if you're intimidated by someone, just imagine them sitting on the loo, because that's what all humans do. And I feel like, in a way, that kind of mute, so there's a slightly more sanitized equivalent of that, because, we all mess it up and we all look stupid, and the tech gets the better of all of us. And that just kind of brings a bit of humanity, not to mention, kids climbing over things, seeing people's backgrounds. It humanizes stuff so much more. And we're bringing maybe more of our own lives and authentic selves to our jobs, because we can't but do that, even deciding what cheesy virtual kind of green screen background you want, is a kind of talking point, and something that perhaps lowers those, barriers between people, as you said.
Yeah, definitely. I think the further we go into lockdown, the more people feel at ease with this as a form of, I'm at my screen all day. On the weekends, I'm doing pub quizzes with friends. So it's just, I think it brings more of a level playing field in terms of, as we said, people who are kind of more well-heeled with connections, went to private school, who have access to finance and parents to help them kind of succeed in the sector. It's almost not just tackling that inequality, but also tackling the inequality in terms of the cultures of newsrooms, which isn't always accessible to a wider kind of demographic.
Yeah, and I think we will go back to normal, and I think that's a good thing. People, I guess, maybe the extroverts more than the introverts among us, really kind of really wanting, craving, getting back out there and doing all of that. And, we shouldn't kind of just cast all that aside, for sure. But I think it's a matter of really thinking carefully and considerately, what do we keep from this setup? Mm-hmm. And Prescott is working, on a couple of quite exciting, innovative ways of accessing people that we are hoping to work with newsrooms to set up and get in place, schemes, for example, to what we are calling pre-internship kind of schemes, to prepare people who perhaps feel there's either a social or an expectational kind of divide between where they're coming from and, what they're going to experience in the newsroom. And so this is a perfect, way almost to show with something like Presspad Remote how many people we've reached, how we can get people really, really bring them kind of up to a certain point, so that when they enter the newsroom, it's not a big cultural shock. It's not something where they're spending the first kind of 3 or 4 days just grappling with HR and working out how to fit in. Maybe they've already had a Zoom kind of tour of the newsroom, and they know what it looks like, and it's not scary. There are lots of different things we can do to kind of bridge that gap. And we're working with some partners already to bring something like that out, because we think that those are the sorts of things that we should hold on to and kind of maintain from this sort of, bizarre experience, and that shouldn't kind of just be abandoned once everybody comes back to offices.
Sure, I don't think everyone's kind of ready-made at that age to go straight into an internship and climb the ladder. People have, they may have not been kind of party to that environment, or they don't know how to kind of operate or what it's like being in a newsroom. I think it's, I think it's good that we've kind of discussed some real kind of positive aspects of just not just what can come out of the pandemic in terms of media industry, but also just practical solutions. I was kind of sat up writing my event script, and it seemed more negative than it turned out, which has been really great.
And I do think, you know, it is going to be really difficult, you know, and I think that there are, I mean, I would not want to be graduating right now, and I have a lot of sympathy for other young people, but, you know, we will keep going on. And I think, you know, the wonderful thing about journalism, and I think, you know, we're seeing this more and more, especially as well with, you know, I think freelance journalists and, you know, activists as well, and, you know, issues around, for example, you know, Black Lives Matter and, you know, BAME journalists, you know, I think that we're seeing a kind of solidarity, you know, about how we are all responsible, you know, either by perpetuating, you know, or creating the kind of systems and structures that we live in. And so I think, you know, it is difficult, but that kind of adversity, you know, has a habit of bringing people together in very creative ways to find solutions, because we don't have any other alternative. And so we look to one another, do you know what I mean, to find ways of collaborating, because, you know, that's the only way forward. And for those who do feel, you know, hopeless, or feel like they, you know, are isolated and don't see those opportunities to collaborate, that's why something like PressPad exists, because, you know, it's not just us, there's so many other organizations that are doing different things. We can definitely, you know, if there is something in particular that you're passionate about or that you're struggling with, we can point you to somebody else, an individual or an organization, you know, who will have something to offer you. You know, even, for example, you guys, you know, I'm sure that there will be young journalists who are very interested in, you know, certain type of politics, who now I know that you exist, you know, I can say, check this out. This is something that you could join. They do regular, how many events did you say you've done since lockdown?
110, which is more than we normally do.
Blows my mind. So there's, you know, there's loads of stuff out there. And I think, you know, everybody connecting with one another in this social space does really, you know, open up doors and allow people to kind of move sideways and try things, as you say, that, you know, previously might have felt like a much bigger ask, financially or just time-wise.
Yeah, and from a more biased point of view, if we have more people with young Fabians writing as journalists, then we might get a Labour government in a few years' time.
I can't comment. I am
of course
not. So, but no, I mean, I think, you know, as you say, politics as well has seen a massively, you know, varied, and I'm sure you've spoken about this a ton, you know, a very, very different way of working. So, you know, as someone who is interested in social mobility and social structures, it's been interesting even beyond, you know, journalism, to see how lots of different things are being highlighted. And even if, you know, the negative and the depressing parts of what we're seeing in the news are things like, you know, the deficiencies in our, you know, care system, those at least are being flagged, where previously people were suffering in silence and these issues weren't considered important.
Yeah.
So the first step is always acknowledging that there's a problem. Even that can be considered a positive thing if then it shines a light and is forcing people then, you know, to do something about it.
Absolutely. I think that's a really brilliant place to end on. And yeah, I mean, just one kind of bit of information about how people can access you, how they can find out about PressPad and get involved.
So we're at PressPad UK across all our social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And you can also, if you want to email me directly, I'm at olivia@presspad.co.uk. And we have a newsletter and a blog as well. So if you were to go to our website, www.presspad.co.uk, you can also sign up for those, and everything basically goes from there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been a really interesting discussion.
All right, thanks, Charlie.
And yeah, we'll circulate around some of those pieces that you posted, and just how people can take it from there and get involved in Press Remote.
Great, thank you so much.
Great, thanks very much.
Well done, Charlie. If you look at the top, you can press stop broadcasting on Facebook and stop recording.
Okay. Stop live stream, stop recording. You'll receive an email notification when the cloud recording is ready.
That's good. Well done.
Cool.